Usually Frank Isola joins us on Thursday, but we had the governor of Texas on Thursday in his usual spot, so he was gracious enough to join us now on Friday morning. You've probably been bumped for worse than the governor of Texas, I would imagine, in your career, Frank, because I certainly have.
Well, I was going to ask you. They always say in the business, that's a good get. So when you get the president on the phone, so in terms of gets, where do I rank after you get the president of the United States? Where am I in the top 10? Do I crack the top 25, the top 100? Where am I in that ranking?
On the flow chart? Well, it's like I usually do an interview with my friends at Jocks in Birmingham, and everything was so wacky after I did the president interview on Tuesday that I was like, well, I'm going to go to the gym and work out. I've got a lot of energy, obviously. I want to get away from my phone for a little while because it blew up. Everybody kind of giving me feedback on that literally the minute we hung up with the president. And I totally forgot that I had a segment scheduled with them. So that having done radio, one of the challenges in radio is when you have a guest segment set up and like you tease it and you're ready to talk about a certain subject and then your guest doesn't show up. So I try to never miss, right? Like if I say I'm going to be somewhere for a radio hit, and you're great about this, I think people who do radio are typically pretty good about that because you know how challenging it can be to build the idea of a segment, not to mention what it sounds like, and then you lose somebody. So I felt bad about that, but they immediately were like, oh, you get the president of the United States on, you've been doing our show for years, and you missed the first time ever. Like, I was just in the gym. I was just kind of rattled about the whole process. It was so unique. And I said before, Frank, I was so concerned, not about the interview, but just, like, would our tech work? Would his phone drop in the middle of the interview?
Yeah.
Would something go wrong with my audio and we can't, like I'm talking and I can't hear the president I was only concerned about the tech background, right? Because if you told me, hey, everything's going to go smooth for 20 minutes and the president's going to talk with you, I wouldn't have been very nervous at all. But all of the tech aspects, I just didn't want us to fall flat on our face and screw it up.
Have you been nervous, interviewing, whether it's a professional athlete or a head coach? Have you, is there one person when you've interviewed them you're thinking, man, kind of those same things. You don't want any technical issues to go wrong, but you're just getting nervous, and then you probably stop to think to yourself, what am I so nervous about? I'm just talking to basically somebody over the phone. Has that ever been the case?
I was nervous nervous and also excited about the president because I don't know how many times in your life you get to interview the president. And I think early in my radio career, before I had ever spent much time doing interviews on the radio, we had some big names, and maybe I was a little bit nervous or apprehensive just because I was new to the radio game, right? But I haven't been nervous, and I was nervous. Somebody asked me, it's a good question. I think I talked about this a little bit with Will Kane on our podcast. I'm curious for you too. I get nervous when I haven't done something before. So I'll give you a couple of examples for television. I had never been in a television studio doing a show until we did the Fox College football kickoff show that launched FS1 back in, I think it was 2013. So that's now been 7 years. But I had literally never been in a television studio in my entire life. And so the night before we were doing that live for the first time, I was super, super nervous. Right? I've never done live television in a studio, and then we're debuting with a 2-hour live television show. And so that is just it's a very, and you've done television now in studios, but it's a very different feel than what maybe you're used to before. So I was nervous about that. I would say I was nervous the first time that I was going to go do radio for 3 hours because I hadn't done it before, both solo for this show and also solo. I did a weekend show for NBC Sports, but even as part of a trio, when I started doing radio daily, I was nervous about that. It's always things that I haven't done before, which I think are important challenges. And I've never obviously interviewed the president before, but I'm curious for you. I don't really get nervous in any way about things that I've done before. It's always something new, a new challenge that kind of factors in. And I'll give you another one that was pretty wacky. We did, and this is still crazy to me, that same year in 2013, somebody got sick, and we had some time to fill because there was a weather delay. and they set me down at FS1 live on television during a halftime and during weather delays and said, hey, we're doing highlights. You're going to have to lead some of these highlights. And I was like, okay. I had, like, Frank, I was so green. I didn't even know that when you did highlights, like I had never sat at the highlights desk. I didn't realize there was a monitor built into the highlights desk so I could look down at what was happening on the screen and talk about it as it was occurring. I had never done that in my life, and I did it live on television with FS1 with a bunch of time to fill. And so I didn't have time necessarily to get nervous about that, but I'm like, how many people have never done a highlight before in their life, and then they get set down at a table and you're doing it live on the air on Fox? And later they were like, hey, that's what Fox does. They throw you in, at least back then, I don't know if they still consider it, but they would throw you into the water and just find out whether you were going to sink or swim. And so, you're not even have enough time to even think about necessarily what's going on. But all those that I just kind of ran through are things in my media career that I had never done before. What about you? Have you, do you get nervous still when you do PTI or something like that? Or is it so second nature now that you're kind of used to it?
I'm down here in D.C., in fact, right down the street from the White House. The other day you had some guy rush the Secret Service police and they shot him. So that wasn't too far from where I am. But doing PTI in D.C. is easy because I'm usually in the studio. Here they're doing it because social distancing. Michael Wilbon's in one studio, I'm in another. So when you can't see the person, that's difficult. Plus, there are some times when they show me on the screen, so I'm looking at myself as I'm talking, and it's like mortifying. Like I could see myself on TV if I'm in a bar. The worst thing is to hear yourself and see yourself at the same time. I've always said this about all these movie stars. I don't know how they go to a premiere of their movie and sit in a crowded movie theater and see themselves on a gigantic screen. I would never be able to do that. There's no chance I'd be able to do that. But I don't know if it's being nervous. It's just a little bit tougher. But I prefer, when you do live TV, the one thing about it, you're more on edge, you're more alert, because there's kind of not a fallback and you kind of have to just forge through it, even if you made a mistake. But you mentioned the highlights, and this is what I think works with the TNT crew when they're doing the NBA highlights. All right, so the other night you had a game with Damian Lillard where there were certain plays where you have to specifically talk about them. The three-pointer that he made to tie the game up at 1:30, that was the one that went straight up in the air and came down. Then the offensive foul that he drew on Trey Burke. Those are particular plays where you don't want to break them down. But for the most part, what TNT does, they're showing highlights of a game that most people already watched.
Right.
So they don't really go through each play. So as they're showing the highlights, I think it's always funny where Barkley just starts talking about something random. So you're kind of watching the highlights, but you're listening to what they're talking about. It could be anything, and it just works sometimes, as opposed to the traditional on the 6 o'clock news, the sports anchor is showing highlights of a game that maybe a majority of people didn't see. So the highlight thing is not easy to do. It's a lot easier to do if the highlights are just running and you're just talking about something random from the game.
Yeah, and you pointed out something that I think is also interesting. When you're taping versus when you're live, almost all the time with our TV show, we're live. But sometimes we tape. If we're in studio or there's something going on that they want to get on, camera earlier. And I always think you can tell, at least I can, the difference between a tape segment and a live segment. Because taped in the back of your mind, you're like, hey, if I screw it up on television, we can go back and we can adjust it. And you don't have the same electricity. Does that make sense? Because you're basically tap dancing on, above especially in our era that we're in now. When you're doing live television or live radio, like we do a lot of, there's no safety net, like you were talking about earlier. So you're trying to walk across the rope, and there's a lot of, there's a lot of crocodiles below you and everything else. And there's an excitement and there's a tension to it that doesn't necessarily exist, I think, particularly in television, when you're taping. I did a college football Friday night show, which I still think is just a gold mine of a market, because I think there's lots of people sitting around on Friday night who are eager for college football to get there. But we did that, and we would tape it, and I liked it. But what I would always say is I want to go straight through. If we're going to tape, let's go straight through 2 hours. Let's try to be as efficient as possible, because I hate spending more time doing something than you would if you were doing it live. And sometimes they're like, oh, we messed up a graphic, let's come back. What I have found, I'm curious if you do as well, is most people don't notice the subtle imperfections or the subtle inaccuracies. That's something that people get obsessed with when they're watching, producers or whatever else. But the average viewer, I think, kind of accepts the fact that things are not always going to go perfect and just rolls with it.
And I think that was the one thing when they started doing PTI was they liked the idea because they looked at it this way. These are two newspaper guys, not technically trained in doing television. And that's why they have this segment where if they made a mistake, they're kind of upfront about it. They said, we screwed up, and how many times does Tony or Mike look down at a note that they gave? So as opposed to trying to pretend, see, I'm an expert on everything and I remember everything, they look at their notes because reporters do that. So it makes it a lot more authentic. I think you're right. When it's, if you're looking for the show to be perfect, shows aren't always going to be perfect, and I think that's probably one of the things that works with PTI.
PTI is the most successful sports television show of all time, other than like SportsCenter, right? I mean, a personality, opinion-based driven show. Do you think there will – because I kind of look at PTI now, and I loved Kornheiser and Wilbon. I think we've talked about this before. I went to college in D.C. Before they were television superstars. They were two of the most talented columnists anywhere, right? So I would read their columns every day in the Washington Post and just be blown away by how smart, funny, witty those columns were. And they really kind of drove the national conversation in the nation's capital. And the Washington Post at that time was just such an incredible newspaper in general with everything that it would have. It was a quarter. I'm going to sound like an old man now, but it was when I started college, you could get the Washington Post for a quarter. And it was, the internet was just starting. We didn't even have the internet in most of our dorm rooms. So the newspaper still had primacy. But I think, what year did PTI start? Like 2000, something like that, if I'm not mistaken?
Yeah.
I'm not sure, and I'm curious if you think, do you think there will ever be another influential television show as influential as PTI, or did they hit the market at the perfect time? They've obviously developed a huge audience over the years. I'm just not sure that we'll ever see another show as influential as PTI.
Yeah, and I think, because to your point, they're not coming into television as 25-year-old guys. They're coming in when they're, late 40s, early 50s, and, the whole thing of the newspaper columnists, if you think about it now, a lot of those guys really don't exist anymore. And these guys were covering everything. Like I mentioned to Mike yesterday, we were talking about the 5 overtime game in hockey, and I said, I like hockey. I said, you can't have a 5-hour game, especially in game 1 of the playoffs. I said, Mike, remember that game in '87 when the Islanders played the Caps? It was a game 7, it went to 4 overtime. I said, yeah, I was at the game. In fact, me and Tony were both at the game. Like those guys were actually out there covering stuff all the time. So you don't really have that general columnist. I'll give you a perfect example of the whole general columnist. If you go back to, which was a great story, the Lou Williams, Lou Wings, as we all call him now, right? It blew me away that there wasn't one national columnist or even one NBA columnist that didn't write. The NBA has to make an example of Lou Williams. They have to just send him home and tell him your season is over. Yeah. Like if this were 10 years ago, at least 5 people would have written that. Like this is how so much it's changed, I think, for the columnists too, because you and I have spoken about this. I think it's such an access-driven climate that we live in now. Nobody wants to tick anybody off. I might be ticking the league off a little bit. Maybe not so much Lou Williams, because do you really need Lou Williams and to be like a source or whatever the case may be? Maybe I don't want to tick off the Clippers. But 10 years ago, forget 20 years ago, there would have been a lot more people. It's just a lot different now. I was shocked that not one person wrote, because it wouldn't have been the most outrageous thing. He violated the rules, and come on. And listen, we're all adults here. He didn't. Yes, I'm sure he loves the Wings there. There's other things that he loves there, which is why he went there. Could one person write that the NBA should make an example of him? All this money they're spending for a bubble, you're out. You're done.
We're talking to Frank Isola at the Frank Isola. Does a great job on PTI. He's down in D.C. right now. Obviously, all week, the big topic, I would say, if you're talking about big sports topic, has been college football. The Big Ten, the Pac-12 cancel. It appears the ACC, the SEC, and the Big 12 are going to stay strong. I know you're based in New York. The Notre Dame has a huge fan base in the New York area. They always have. They're still going to play. They may be the only Midwest school with a substantial following that is going to play. What do you think the impact is? How much attention did you see being given to the college football story? And what do you think the long-lasting impact here is, assuming that the SEC, the ACC, and the Big 12 play, and the Pac-12 and the Big 10 sit out. Big story through the fall, or is it a little bit like Major League Baseball where, oh my God, the Marlins test positive and everybody's like, we got to cancel Major League Baseball season? But then as soon as things start to calm down, it's like the people out there saying baseball has to be canceled disappear too. What do you think the impact here is going to be as we move closer to the fall?
I think it's huge. I definitely think it's huge in the Midwest, but there's also a chance, the Final Four teams would have been Clemson, Alabama, another team from the SEC, and maybe Oklahoma. So those would have been the teams anyway that made it. I do think it just shows you the power of college football, that you had the president chiming in, you had senators, governors chiming in, obviously the players and the coaches. My daughter plays soccer in the Big East, and, she knew basically 2 weeks ago that there probably wasn't going to be a season. They announced it yesterday that fall sports are off in the Big East. I think what's going to happen is, I've always felt all along the SEC was going to play, and it seems like these other conferences are committed to playing. And I think what Ryan Day said yesterday about wanting to play in January, I think if college football and these other conferences gets off to a good start, I can see these other conferences thinking, you know what, maybe we could pull this off. Obviously, on the West Coast, it's not going to be a problem with the weather, but you know what, who cares? Football's played in cold weather, and that's something maybe the Big Ten schools will have to do. So I think if they are able to pull it off in these other places, maybe they will play football. I think that, what was an interesting part of it? Let's say there was no college football. You have to figure the NFL would have thought maybe we'll get 2 games on a Saturday, if not 3
100%.
games. We could have national games Thursday, Saturday, Sunday, Monday. Think about that.
Oh, I don't think there's any doubt. And even figuring out now, I mean, if you look around the television landscape, so Fox, for instance, and FS1 have the Big Ten, they have the Pac-12, and they have part of the Big 12, right? So let's take the Big Ten and the Pac-12 off the horizon. What do they do with the Big 12? Do they put more of their games on? Do they figure out a way to get them into more primetime viewership? And then for ESPN, they've got the ACC, they've got the SEC, and the Big 12. Yes, losing out on the Big 10 will hurt them. Losing out on the Pac-12, they've got a part of that too. But this is a pretty big deal, I think, to be able to preserve their calendars. I don't think there's any doubt. If the NFL had the option to ride in and take over Saturdays for college football this season, they would do it in a heartbeat. And I just think it's fascinating. Do you agree with me on the Major League Baseball? And we're talking with Frank Isola, where it seems like, Frank, and I'm curious if you agree with me, when you look at Major League Baseball, the Marlins have their issue, and the media is like sharks with blood in the water. They all come swarming, and they're like, oh, my God, there's no way we can play. What in the world is Major League Baseball thinking? And then when Rob Manfred came out and kind of made a strong statement saying, hey, we're going to figure out a way to play. I know the Cardinals still have their issue, but it was like all it took was somebody in a position of power to stand up strong and actually say, no, we're not going to turn tail at the first sign of failure. We're going to try to figure out a way to play. And the media eventually just all kind of disappeared. And I don't know about you, but I hear very little about the idea of Major League Baseball needing to be canceled now. It's like you just have to stare down that story for 2 or 3 days, and then the media realizes you're not going to buckle, and they move on. Am I crazy, or do you kind of get that sense too?
I think if you go back to April, or maybe it was early May or some part of May when Germany was going to start up and their teams were back training, the same thing happened in England with the Premier League. There were players testing positive that were in camp. And right away the feeling was, oh, see, this is why you're not going to be able to pull it off. And they kind of forged ahead. And I think that's always been baseball's thought. And remember, too, I think that the baseball commissioner went into it thinking, okay, if we're not going to play in a bubble scenario, we're going to have a situation where there's going to be positive test. Maybe we'll have to shut down that team for a certain amount of games. We know that everyone's not going to play 60 games because, let's face it, a 60-game baseball season, that's not enough games. You got to, can you at least play, 81, play half the season? So I think baseball went into it knowing, let's try to get this season completed. So clearly, you're going to have teams that play 60. There could even be teams that play under 50 games. They'll just base it on winning percentage. That's why they'll have more teams in the playoffs. If you're going to go to a format where you don't have a bubble, and college football will be like this too, you have to be willing to kind of forge ahead, and just whoever tests positive, you kind of quarantine, you do the contact tracing and everything like that. But I do think when baseball started out, and you know what, here's the thing too with baseball. They didn't create enough goodwill because while all this stuff was going on and millions of people across the country were losing their jobs, they were fighting over money.
Yep.
And nobody wanted to hear that. And that's really where baseball blew it. Baseball should have done everything they could to get back by July 1st, because it was before all the other sports had started. They would have had some time to themselves. And it is tough, Clay, when you watch baseball and you see some of these. For whatever reason, an empty baseball stadium just looks so much different than what they have with the NBA in Orlando.
I agree completely.
What they're doing with the NHL, it's jarring to see Wrigley Field and Fenway Park, Yankee Stadium, even though nobody sits behind home plate anymore at Yankee Stadium. But it's jarring to see those places empty.
There's no doubt. Final question for you, and we're talking Frank Isola at the Frank Isola. We've now got the at least the preliminaries for the NBA playoffs. How would you assess the bubble as its return has been for the NBA in general? Do you think it's been a positive? Do you think it's been a negative? Now that we're now moving into the playoffs and we know what it's going to look with the playoff, the play-in games, 8, 9, all that set up, how would you assess the overall bubble initial part before we get to the playoffs?
I think it's very good. They're going to be getting rid of, it will be 5 teams after tomorrow will be heading home, and then you'll have another team of 16 once that 8-9 playing game is done. Notice though, you haven't seen a lot of pictures of guys fishing, playing all kinds of games and stuff. The players have been down there now 6 weeks, so I think I could see guys getting restless. And I got to be honest with you, Clay, they came out with the story the other day about families, like who's allowed to come down after the first round. So now you're going to have a scenario with some players with wives and kids, a lot of players with girlfriends. Are you allowed to bring multiple girlfriends down, your buddies? Things could get a little hairy, and you know this because you and I have been in this scenario. When you're on the road working and you have your family with you, it's not that easy. Like when everyone else is kind of on vacation, so to speak, and you're working, it's a tough scenario. And I think for the players, there's no way that one player could say, I don't want you coming down, yet the rest of the team is having family members come down. So that element, they're doing it, listen, for the players' welfare, but it's going to be very interesting to see what kind of issues that may cause once you get – now, remember, you'll be down to 8 teams because it'll be after the first round, so it's fewer teams. But I think that aspect of it's going to be interesting in a couple of weeks.
No doubt. Frank Isola, go watch him on PTI. You can follow him on Twitter at the Frank Isola. Listen to him on SiriusXM and on this show weekly. Also, a lot to get into next week.